I bought a property with a terrifying history no one told me about. It was cheap for a reason. Something had been trapped here since 1887. I thought I'd found peace. I was wrong. The land had other plans. It started the way most terrible decisions do, with good intentions. I needed out of the city, out of my mind, out of whatever hole I'd been digging myself into for the past year pretending I was still a writer. The words hadn't come in months. My sleep was fractured, and the thought of hearing another neighbor slam a door or a siren scream through my window made my teeth grind. I wanted silence, not the kind you get with earplugs, but the kind that sinks into your bones, the kind where the world forgets you exist long enough for you to remember who you are. I didn't want a vacation. I wanted exile, solitude, and maybe a little madness if it brought the words back. So I started looking. Cabins, cottages, anything 2 hours outside the city. Prices were absurd. Everything charming was either crumbling or already claimed. It was like the universe had boarded up the exits. Until one rainy Tuesday afternoon, I saw it. Historic Victorian home. Priced to sell. Immediate possession. 5 bedrooms. 10 acres. Built in the 1800s. The photos were few. Just one, actually, but enough to catch my attention. The house loomed behind a veil of trees, gray and regal and somehow defiant, as if it had survived things no one wanted to talk about. I clicked. There was no description beyond sold as is, Maddox estate, motivated seller. Motivated seller. That phrase should have meant something to me, should have been a red flag, but I was tired, desperate, curious. So I called the number on the listing. A woman answered on the second ring. Her voice was clipped, professional, and faintly uneasy. "I'm calling about the house on Valley Ridge," I said. A pause. "You're referring to the Maddox property?" "That's the one." Another pause. "Are you familiar with its history?" "Not yet." "I see." She cleared her throat. "The estate is being sold as is. The heirs are no longer in the country. They want it closed quickly. If you're serious, we can arrange a viewing for tomorrow." There was something in her voice. Not reluctance. More like restraint. As if she was warning me without violating a script. I said yes. The drive out took just under 2 hours. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then narrowed to a single lane winding through tall pines that hadn't seen pruning in decades. Fog clung low to the forest floor. My GPS lost signal a mile before I arrived. Then the trees parted and I saw it. The house stood like a monument. 3 stories tall, weathered wood siding, a wraparound porch tangled with ivy. Windows lined the upper floors like watching eyes. It wasn't just old. It was ancient in posture, not broken. Waiting. A silver sedan was parked near the gate. The realtor was already outside, arms folded, coat buttoned to the throat. She didn't wave. "You found it," she said as I stepped out. "You weren't kidding about remote." She smiled faintly. "That's part of the appeal, I imagine. I thought you'd meet me inside." She glanced at the house. "I prefer to stay out here. I've shown it enough times to know the layout." "You're not coming in?" Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did. "I have a bit of a cold. Fresh air helps." It was a flimsy excuse and she knew it, but I didn't press. A part of me, the part that had once written ghost stories for a living, was already filling in the blanks. I climbed the porch steps alone. The wood creaked underfoot, damp from the mist. The door opened with a surprising ease, no groan, no resistance, as if it had been oiled recently. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Old wood, dust, and something else, sweet, almost cloying, like fruit that had ripened too long in a dark pantry. The foyer was wide, with a grand staircase stretching up into shadow. To the right, a sitting room with sheet-covered furniture. To the left, a dining room with a table long enough to seat 12. Every surface wore a thin veil of dust, but there was no decay, no cobwebs, just stillness. Through the realtor's muffled voice from outside, I wandered deeper. The kitchen was fitted with an antique iron stove. A library stood empty, its tall shelves stripped bare. In the back, a sunroom looked out onto an overgrown garden littered with broken statues and gnarled rose bushes. Upstairs, 5 bedrooms lined the hall. Most were barren, but the master remained intact. A massive 4-poster bed, its mattress bare but made, stood in the center. The linens were yellowed with age, but untouched by time. I opened a closet and found it empty. No hangers, no scent of mothballs, just space. The 3rd floor had 2 small rooms and a ceiling hatch. A thin chain dangled from it, leading to an attic I decided not to explore just yet. Something about it felt private, like a door you didn't open on the first date. Back outside, the realtor hadn't moved from her position near the car. "Well?" she asked, brushing rain from her sleeve. "I'll take it," I said, before I could think too hard. My voice came out flat, almost automatic. She blinked. "That was fast." "I know," I replied, "but it feels right." For a moment, something crossed her face, surprise, concern, maybe even pity, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "The heirs will be relieved. If you can close within the week, they'll accept a lower offer." I nodded. She handed me a single key. "We'll begin paperwork this afternoon." And that was it. No counteroffer, no delay. By nightfall, the house was mine. And as I lay in bed that first night, staring at the cracked ceiling, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak from the floor above, step, step. But I hadn't been to the attic yet, and I lived alone. The morning came slowly, bleeding gray light through the thin lace curtains of the master bedroom. I lay still for a long time, not because I was rested, but because something about the house demanded stillness, like it hadn't quite decided if I belonged here yet. When I finally rose, the silence was complete. No birdsong, no hum of traffic, no distant barking. Just the creak of floorboards beneath my feet and the distant drip of a leaking faucet somewhere downstairs. I made coffee the way I had the day before. Slow, careful, mechanical. It helped me pretend the strange sound I heard during the night was just the house settling. Old wood shifts, pressure changes. Perfectly normal, nothing to worry about. But the unease didn't leave. It just quieted, like a dog retreating to the corner of the room to watch. After breakfast, I started to explore in earnest. Without the veil of newness and adrenaline, the house felt different, off balance, as if the walls were holding their breath. Every room had an almost intentional emptiness, not just from being uninhabited, but as though something had been stripped out, not moved, removed. The smell was stronger today. Dust, mildew, wood polish. And beneath it all, a sickly sweetness that reminded me of decayed fruit or something left out in the sun too long. I started in the library. It was the room I'd intended to make my sanctuary. The desk was beautiful. Dark oak, clawfoot legs, smooth as glass despite its age. But the shelves were what unnerved me. Every single one was empty. Not just books gone. Not rearranged. Empty in a way that felt deliberate. Like they'd never held anything at all. No dust outlines. No forgotten dog-eared paperbacks or faded spines. Just polished blank wood. It felt sterile, sanitized, except for one shelf. Second row from the top, far left corner. A gap in the grain barely an inch wide. I ran my finger along it and felt a notch, a false panel. I pulled gently, it clicked open. Inside was a single piece of folded paper. I opened it. 3 words. handwritten in old ink, not yet ready. No signature, no context. I placed it back where I found it, and I moved on. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I wandered from room to room, noting strange scratches on the door frames, faint patterns worn into the floorboards that didn't match foot traffic, and a peculiar dampness near the upstairs linen closet. Not wet, just humid, like the wall was exhaling. Eventually, I found myself at the third-floor landing. The air felt colder here, more brittle. The 2 rooms up there were small, servants' quarters maybe, but neither had been touched in decades. Wallpaper peeled in thin curling sheets. One of the windows was nailed shut from the inside, and then there was the ceiling hatch. It sat in the middle of the narrow hallway, an old iron latch locking it in place. A short rope dangled from the edge like a reluctant invitation. I didn't pull it, not yet. I told myself I was tired, that I'd explore the attic later, that there was no rush. But the truth was simpler. Something behind that hatch didn't want me to look, and I wasn't ready to argue. That night, I lit a fire in the library hearth. The warmth didn't quite reach the corners of the room, but it helped. I curled up in the worn armchair with a notebook, trying to write something, anything, to remind myself why I'd come here in the first place. But the words wouldn't come. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it again. Footsteps. Above me, measured, slow, from one side of the ceiling to the other. I didn't move at first, just listened. Step, step, stop, silence. Then again, step, step. This wasn't the sound of a house settling. This wasn't pipes or weather or raccoons. Someone was walking directly above the library, and the only thing above me was the attic. I grabbed the flashlight and crept up the stairs. The house groaned with each step, louder than before, as if trying to warn me off. The hallway on the 3rd floor was darker now. The single bulb overhead buzzed, then went out completely. In the dark, I felt for the pull rope. It wasn't there, but the hatch was open. The ladder had already unfolded, touching the floor like a tongue unfurling. My heart hammered in my throat. I shone my light up the opening. The attic was a long, narrow space, the peak of the roof forming a triangular ceiling. Dust floated in the beam like ash. Old furniture stood under yellowing sheets, trunks, broken mirrors, something that looked like a dollhouse. It was silent. I climbed slowly. Each step on the wooden ladder groaned under my weight, and I couldn't help but feel like the sound wasn't mechanical. It was vocal, like the house didn't want me there. At the top, I scanned the attic. Empty, mostly, except for the far wall. There, partially hidden behind an old mattress and a stack of covered picture frames, was a door. Not an attic crawl space, not a closet. A full door, painted white, a heavy brass knob, and a rusted padlock holding it shut. It didn't match the rest of the attic. The wood looked newer, untouched by dust. I stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath me. Not a small noise, but a full, low groan, like something shifting below the boards. I shone the flashlight down. Footprints, bare, small, pressed into the dust. They led from the door to the center of the attic and vanished. I turned the light back to the door. That's when I saw it. A single slip of paper pinned with a thumbtack to the center panel. The edges curled. The ink faded. I stepped forward, heart in my throat, and read the message. Some debts can't be paid. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't touch the door. I just backed away, slowly, down the ladder, down the stairs, back to the library. I sat by the fire for the rest of the night, staring at the flames, waiting to hear those footsteps again. They never came, but I knew I wasn't alone, and the door was still locked. For now. It was the third morning before I ventured beyond the house. The fog was thinner that day, sunlight struggling through the trees in scattered shafts, slicing across the grass like faded ribbons. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and something faintly metallic. I slipped on my boots, zipped up my jacket, and stepped off the porch into the overgrown yard. The property stretched 10 acres, bordered on the east and north by dense woods. There were no fences, no paths, just tall grass, twisted vines, and forgotten stonework, remnants of some once formal garden plan swallowed by time. I walked slowly, letting the cold bite my skin and shake the house's weight off my shoulders. Behind the house, I found a shattered stone bench, half swallowed by roots. Beyond it, a row of crumbling statues lined what must have once been a walkway, now just a series of uneven stones buried beneath moss and leaves. Most of the statues had lost their faces. One was missing its head entirely. The garden ended abruptly at a line of trees. Tall, bare-limbed oaks stood like sentries, bark peeling in long vertical strips. Something about the tree line felt unnatural. Not threatening exactly, just deliberate, like it had been placed there, not grown. I was about to turn back when I noticed it. A shape in the distance, low to the ground, pale against the darkness of the woods. I moved closer. Then I saw them. 7 wooden crosses, each about 2 feet high, lined up in a perfectly straight row along the edge of the forest. They weren't fresh. The paint had peeled away, wood grayed and splintered from decades of exposure. They stood like forgotten gravestones, unmarked, unadorned, nearly swallowed by the undergrowth. I didn't touch them. I didn't want to. Something about them felt wrong. Not because they existed, but because of where they were. Each cross faced the house. Each one leaned forward just slightly, as if bowing or straining toward it. I took a step back and scanned the tree line behind them. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like I was being watched. Not from the house, from the woods. I squinted, heart thudding. Nothing moved. No birds, no animals, no sound at all, just stillness. Cold, waiting stillness. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees until the line of crosses disappeared behind the tall grass. By the time I reached the porch, my hands were shaking. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. My mind kept returning to the crosses, why they were there, who put them up, why there were 7. I thought about the attic, the locked door, the footprints, the note. Some debts can't be paid. Were the crosses part of that debt? That night, I sat by the fire again. No music, no TV, just the pop of burning wood and the occasional groan of old beams adjusting to the cold. Around 11, I went to bed. I lay awake for nearly an hour, the silence pressing down on me. And then I heard it. Laughter. Faint, distant, high-pitched. Children. I sat up, heart slamming against my ribs. It came again, closer now, giggling. Light, almost playful, like a game was being played just outside the window. I got up and crossed the room. My hand hesitated at the curtain. Something in me, something instinctual, told me not to look. But I looked anyway. At first, I saw only the snow. It had started sometime after sunset, blanketing the ground in a thick, pale layer that glowed faintly under the moonlight. Then, movement, just at the edge of the woods. A small figure, no taller than a child, darted between the trees. Then another, and another. My breath caught. They were running, circling, stopping, staring. Their movements were strange. Not frantic, not chaotic, but too fast, too smooth, like they weren't running on the snow but through it, as if the ground wasn't there. Then, one of them stepped into the open. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, barefoot despite the snow, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned nightgown, white and thin and fluttering slightly even though there was no wind. She looked up at my window. I stepped back, my hand dropping from the curtain. The laughter stopped. The silence returned, sudden and complete, as if someone had flipped a switch. I waited, long enough to believe I'd imagined it, that it was a trick of exhaustion or memory. Then, a soft knock on the window. Once. Twice. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The third knock never came. Instead, I heard footsteps moving away across the snow. I stood there for what felt like an hour, barely able to blink. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. The fire downstairs had died. The house was cold. My breath hung in the air above me. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the laughter again, muffled now, like it had gone underground. I closed my eyes, and then I heard it again. Clear. Real. The front door creaked open. Not slammed, not burst, just opened, slow and quiet. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. Then a sound like snow being stepped on. Soft crunching, deliberate and slow. I moved down one step, then another. When I reached the foyer, the door stood wide open, snow blowing in across the hardwood floor. The wind outside was dead still. I stepped outside, flashlight cutting through the darkness, breath steaming from my mouth. The footprints were there, bare, small, leading away from the door and down the hill toward the garden path. I followed them, past the twisted statues, past the shattered bench, toward the trees, and that's when I saw them. 7 small figures, standing in the snow, perfectly still, watching me. The morning after the footprints, I didn't go outside. I didn't make coffee. I didn't write. I sat in the master bedroom, blinds drawn, watching pale light slide across the floor as if even the sun didn't want to touch this place too deeply. I replayed the night again and again, those 7 figures standing motionless in the snow, the girl's eyes at my window, the laughter that felt like it had been echoing in the walls long before I arrived. By noon, the power flickered. Twice. The heat cut out. I wrapped myself in a blanket and paced. My thoughts circled the same question like buzzards around a carcass. What is this place? There were too many fragments, the locked attic door, the empty journals, the realtor's hesitation, the note, and those crosses. That's where my thoughts kept landing. Those 7 crosses at the edge of the woods. I hadn't imagined them. They were real, physical. Someone had put them there for a reason. Maybe they were the boundary, the warning line, and I had crossed it. By mid-afternoon, I grabbed my coat and flashlight and headed back outside, following the same path through the withered garden, past the line of crumbling statues to the edge of the woods. The snow crunched beneath my boots, brittle and dry. The wind had stilled, but the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting. The 7 crosses still stood there, silent and splintered, but something about them looked different. As I stepped closer, I realized what it was. They weren't leaning anymore, they were straight, perfectly aligned, as if someone, or something, had stood them upright. My stomach tightened. I turned away from them and faced the woods. The line of trees beyond was still dark, still wrong, but now I noticed something else. A faint path through the brush. Not a trail exactly. just a corridor where the undergrowth thinned slightly, like something had passed through it over and over again, too many times to count. I hesitated, then stepped in. The trees closed around me like a slow exhale. The air was colder here, not just in temperature, but in tone. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. No birds, no insects, no distant creaks of tree limbs in the wind, just the sound of my own breath and the snow underfoot. I followed the faint path for what felt like 20 minutes, deeper and deeper, until the trees opened suddenly into a clearing. And there it was, a mausoleum. Stone, weathered, half sunk into the ground like the forest had tried to swallow it and failed. Vines covered most of the facade, but above the arched entrance, carved deep into the stone, one word remained clear: Maddox, and beneath it, 1887. The iron gate was rusted shut. I rattled it gently and it groaned, swinging inward with a reluctant shriek. Inside, the air changed. It dropped 15 degrees in an instant. My breath plumed out in front of me, white and ragged. The smell was sharp, stone, dampness, and something faintly metallic. The chamber was small, maybe 12 feet wide, lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight. Along the back wall, 7 small stone markers sat in a neat row. Each was carved with a name and a pair of dates: Michael Riley, 1875-1887. Sarah Riley, 1877-1887. James Riley, 1878-1887. William Riley, 1880-1887. Emma Riley, 1882-1887. Abigail Riley, 1884-1887. Thomas Riley, 1886-1887. 7 children, 7 crosses, the same names, the same year, December 21st, 1887. That date had appeared before. In the journals, the locked door. Now it was etched in stone. I stepped closer to one of the headstones and noticed something at its base, half buried under leaves and dust. A small silver object, tarnished, cold. A pocket watch. I picked it up and gently pried it open. Inside, an engraving in careful script. To M, some secrets must remain buried. SWL, SWL. The initials were familiar. They scratched at the edge of a memory. I had seen them in the attic, on a file, on a page. Somewhere. I slipped the watch into my coat pocket. My flashlight flickered. I turned, scanning the chamber again. To the right of the markers was a larger stone sarcophagus, unmarked. No name, no dates, just a single symbol carved into the lid, barely visible through the dirt and moss. A circle with a vertical line through it. The same symbol scratched into the attic doorframe, the same one on the final page of the journal. I stepped closer, feeling the air grow colder. My fingers brushed the edge of the sarcophagus and recoiled instantly. Ice. The stone was freezing. Not cold, not winter-chilled, unnaturally cold. I knelt, brushing aside some of the debris near the base. That's when I noticed the crack. Hairline, almost invisible. Running along the seam of the lid. Not from age. From force, as if something had pushed upward from inside. I stared. The cold pressed against my bones. My breath came faster. I wasn't alone in this place, and whatever had been buried here had not stayed buried. Suddenly, a sound behind me. Soft, faint, the tiniest scuffle of movement against stone. I turned, flashlight sweeping wildly through the shadows. Nothing, but the cold deepened. I backed away slowly, past the row of children's graves, out through the iron gate. The clearing felt darker now. smaller. Like the trees had inched closer. I didn't run, but I didn't walk slowly either. By the time I reached the house, the light was almost gone. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, bolted it, and stood there in the foyer shivering. Not from cold, but from the knowledge that I had found something I was never meant to see. The crypt was real. The children were real. And someone had left me a message in that watch. Some secrets must remain buried. I finally understood what they meant. Because this place didn't just remember the past, it was built to contain it. The next morning, I left the house before the sun could fully rise. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't leave a note. I just walked out, locking the door behind me, even though I knew, deep down, it was pointless. There's a kind of silence that follows you. A pressure, not in your ears, but in your thoughts. And it came with me as I drove the 30 miles into the nearest town, Willingham, population 4,122. I passed shuttered shops, a faded gas station, and a diner that looked unchanged since the 50s. It was the kind of place people went to forget, but I had come to remember. The public records office was built like a church. Tall windows, stained glass, aging stone. But there were no pews inside. Just long wooden tables and towering shelves of manila folders, microfilm, and newspaper clippings yellowed with age. At the reception desk, a woman in her 70s glanced up over her glasses. "You're not from here." I nodded. I just bought the Maddox property. The air shifted, just slightly. Her pen stopped moving. "Wait here." 10 minutes later, I was led to a back room, dustier, darker, quieter than the rest. At the far end sat a man in a cardigan older than me. Thin frame, alert eyes. A silver crucifix around his neck that glinted when he moved. "Name's Elwood Harker," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I was the town's historian before anyone cared what that meant. "You're staying at the Maddox place?" "I am." He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "You need to listen carefully, and you need to know the difference between a story and a warning." The mining accident happened in the winter of 1887. That much was public. A collapse in the North Quarry killed 17 miners. The company paid out hush money. The papers buried it under a snowstorm report. Only one article even mentioned the names of the children. The Riley children. 7 of them. All dead within 24 hours of the collapse. No fire. No explosion. Just a sudden caving in. And then the next morning, 7 siblings, ages 1 through 12, were found lifeless in their beds. No injuries, no poison, just gone. Their father, Samuel Riley, was among the dead in the mine. Their mother, Eleanor, vanished 2 days later. The coroner ruled it grief, but those who lived nearby remembered different things. Elwood leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They said the children weren't dead at all. Not really. They said their eyes stayed open. They said their mouths moved, but no sound came out. They said the doctor screamed when he touched them." I felt my stomach turn. "There were crosses at the edge of the woods. 7. He nodded. "The Maddox family placed them. They were the ones who found the bodies after the undertaker refused to enter the house. But that's when the rumors started about the Pact." "A pact?" Elwood turned and pulled a thin red ledger from the shelf. The paper crackled as he flipped through it. The Maddoxes weren't just landowners. They were custodians. That's the word the town used. They held the land, kept its boundaries, and did what was necessary to keep it quiet. I shook my head. Quiet from what? He stopped flipping pages, looked me dead in the eye. From memory. I didn't understand. He closed the book. Some places hold echoes. Pain. Grief. Horror. They soak into the soil like blood. But that land, it didn't just remember, it preserved, and the Maddoxes made an agreement to contain what was left behind after the mine collapsed. I swallowed hard. Left behind by the accident? No, he said, leaning in, voice a whisper. Left behind by what came out afterward. The Riley children were buried in secret. The funeral was private. The death certificates were forged, and the mine sealed. But something wasn't sealed properly. That's when the Langfords arrived. I felt a chill run up my spine. The Langfords? Elwood stood and crossed the room. From another drawer, he retrieved a folder with an embossed seal, a single vertical line inside a circle. The same symbol from the mausoleum, from the attic, from the door. They weren't clergy. They weren't government. They were something in between. Legal advisors, if you believe the records. Occultists, if you believe the rumors. They advised families on how to handle the unexplainable. And they were deeply involved with the Maddoxes. I opened the folder. Inside were black and white photographs. One showed a group of men and women standing in front of the Maddox house in 1904. One woman in a long dark coat was circled in pencil. Beneath her, Emmeline Langford. They drew up the arrangement, Elwood continued. Not just legal contracts, ritual documentation, wards, symbols, rotations of occupancy. Occupancy? The house couldn't stay empty, ever. Someone had to live there, someone had to witness. That was part of the deal. If the house sat vacant, the ground started to remember too clearly, and then the cold came back. I was shaking now. I saw them in the snow, 7 children. Elwood didn't blink. You saw them because something's wrong. The arrangement is failing, or worse, someone stopped honoring it. I found journals in the attic, and a chest, locked, then open, empty. His eyes narrowed. You shouldn't have gone up there. I stood, breath quickening. I need to know what they are. What they were. He nodded slowly. I'll tell you what the Maddox patriarch wrote in 1890, in the only surviving Langford transcript. He retrieved a brittle, faded page and read aloud. The children were never meant to return, but the mine was not deep enough, the soil did not hold. What we buried does not forget. It wears their faces, it speaks in their voices, but it is not them. It is what grieved them into silence. I stared at him. So, they didn't die in that mine? Elwood closed the file. No, he said quietly. They didn't die in that mine. Something else crawled out in their place. I drove back from Willingham with my hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel my knuckles had gone bloodless. Every streetlight felt like an eye. Every empty road felt like a throat. The Langfords. The arrangement. 7 children that didn't die but became something else. None of it felt like a story anymore. It felt like a sentence. One I hadn't finished reading. I didn't stop at the house. I didn't even look at it. I parked halfway down the driveway, turned off the engine, and walked straight back into the woods, down the faint corridor that twisted through dead leaves and skeletal trees. I no longer hesitated at the line of crosses. I stepped over them like crossing a fault line I could no longer pretend wasn't there. The mausoleum was waiting. More than that, it knew I was coming. The iron gate creaked open before I touched it. The air inside had turned colder still, the kind of cold that doesn't rise from winter, but from beneath, from rot and memory and something older than time. I passed the line of stone markers and approached the unmarked sarcophagus again, heart pounding. Last time I had noticed the carved symbol on the lid. This time, I noticed the edges. Not sealed, not whole. I circled it slowly, brushing my fingers against the stone until they landed on something strange, an indentation along the floor beside the tomb. Subtle, narrow, a seam. I knelt and cleared away the debris. There, nearly invisible in the stone floor, was a square panel, like a trap door, embedded flush against the crypt's foundation. No handle, no lock, just another etched circle with the Langford sigil. I pressed my palm against it, and it opened. A groan echoed from below, stone grinding against stone, as the panel lifted and slid aside, revealing a narrow set of descending stairs. Air gusted up from the opening, thick with mildew and something coppery. I turned on my flashlight and began to descend. The steps spiraled down further than should have been possible. At least 30 feet, possibly more. The walls were lined with smooth stone carved in patterns too worn to decipher. Every few feet, a small alcove opened with a shelf or niche, each holding rotted candles, coins, or fragments of bone. Then I reached the chamber, a small, circular room, no larger than a garden shed. At its center, a stone pedestal, and on that pedestal, a single book. It was bound in thick black leather, edges cracked with time. A red ribbon protruded from its center. On the cover, no title. Just one thing, the Langford symbol. I opened it. Inside, ink faded but legible, script tight and exacting. The first page read, "The record and instruction of Samuel W. Langford, 1888. To be kept hidden, to be kept sacred, to be read only by the one who will choose between silence and release." I sat on the cold floor and began to read. Langford was no occultist. He was a barrister. But he was also a man who'd once prosecuted a case in a town called Black Hollow, where a similar leak had occurred. He'd seen things there he never forgot. Children speaking in voices that were too old, doors that bled when opened, a town swallowed by its own grief. He came to Willingham not to defend the Maddox family, but to contain what had been released. The arrangement, as it was later called, wasn't simply an agreement, it was a binding, a legal spiritual construct designed to anchor an ancient force, something born long before human grief, but that fed on it. An entity that had no name, only attributes. Langford called it the Hollow One. Not a demon, not a ghost, a mirror. It clung to places where tragedy had repeated, where sorrow had no closure, where the names of the dead were spoken in silence, not remembrance. The 7 Riley children, he wrote, were not killed by the collapse. They were claimed by the Hollow One. Their grief, the shock of loss, the abandonment, the moment of unbearable silence was so pure that the force imprinted on them. It used their images like garments, their laughter like bait. It spoke through them, walked with their shadows. Langford's plan wasn't to destroy it. He said that would be foolish. You don't kill a mirror, you cover it. So the mausoleum was built, not to house the children, but to house the echo of them, to bury the reminder. The Maddox family was sworn to remain there, to witness, to rebind the arrangement every solstice with specific rites. The ritual must be performed each December 21st, Langford wrote. The symbols redrawn in salt and ash, the names spoken in order of passing, the candle lit for each and then extinguished backwards. Silence must follow. No music, no speaking, no laughter. Each act was designed to mirror the Hollow One back onto itself, to trap it in its own logic of remembrance. There was even a final instruction. If the witness forgets, even once, the Hollow One tests the borders. The children appear, not as warning, as invitation. I turned to the last page. 7 handprints. child-sized, pressed into the parchment. Beneath them, Langford had written, "They wait, they test, and they remember the children they once were." I closed the journal. The chamber pulsed with cold. As I rose to leave, I noticed something else. A second alcove, hidden behind a split in the wall. I reached into it and withdrew a rusted lantern and a matchbox. Inside the lantern, 7 half-burned candles melted into the base, one for each child. The ritual kit. Langford had prepared it and left it here, in case the family failed, in case someone like me ever found the truth too late. By the time I emerged from the crypt, the sky had turned gray, thick with snow clouds. I didn't need to check the date. I already knew. Tomorrow was December 21st. The solstice, the night of the arrangement. And this time, there were no Maddoxes left. No Langfords to guide me. Only 7 forgotten children. And the thing behind their eyes. She was older than I expected. Not just old in years, old in weight. The kind of age that folds you inward, like the body has grown tired of holding too many memories. Her eyes were sharp, though, even beneath the layers of veined skin and oxygen tubes. When I stepped into her room at the Silver Pines home, she looked up as if she'd been waiting decades for me to arrive. "You're the one who opened the vault," she said. Not a question, a fact. I nodded. "Eliza Langford?" She blinked slowly. I was once. The room was quiet, sterile, too bright. A single chair sat beside her bed, and I eased into it, still holding the journal I'd pulled from the crypt. I laid it on her lap. She didn't touch it, only stared. "I read Samuel's journal," I said. "I found the mausoleum, the handprints, the 7 candles, the names, the warning." Her hand trembled, and she reached to turn off the oxygen for a moment. Her voice came out dry, but clear. "Then it's already too late." Eliza Langford had been raised in the arrangement. She called it the keeping. Her family never used the word curse. They believed curses were things you suffered passively. But the keeping was a responsibility, a job passed through blood and memory. She told me her grandfather, Emery Langford, was Samuel's son. The Langfords weren't supernatural. They weren't prophets. They were lawyers. They understood contracts, especially the kind you couldn't break without consequence. "Samuel thought he could seal the Hollow One with symmetry and law," she said, coughing. "He was wrong. It wasn't law that bound it. It was sacrifice." I asked her what that meant. Her hands clutched her blanket tighter. At first, the ritual required simple things: salt, ash, silence. But over the decades, the ground became greedy. The keeping escalated. She looked me dead in the eyes. It started with animals. They'd offer a crow, a cat, a deer found dead near the tree line, burn it on solstice night, recite the names, circle the house in silence. That held for a while. But then, things shifted. The woods began leaving things at the doorstep, she said. Dead animals with their mouths open, frozen, but smiling. Then came the blood. Not killing, just offering, a cut thumb. A drop into the fire, something living acknowledging something older. By the 1960s, that wasn't enough either. I didn't want to ask the next question, but I did. "Children?" She nodded. Not murder, never murder, but presence. One of the children had to witness the ritual, stand in the circle, see the names, hear the silence. The Hollow One fed on grief, but also on memory. A child's eyes made the memory real. Without that, the ritual collapsed. I was silent for a long moment. Then I asked the question I had been dreading since the attic. What are they? The ones outside? The ones in the snow? Her voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. They wear the children's faces, she said, but they are not children. She told me something Samuel never wrote. The Hollow One inhabits memory, but imperfectly. It can mimic the dead, but only through emotion. It becomes a sketch made of sorrow, an echo of something lost, colored by the grief that created it. So it mimics children, but they aren't playful. They laugh, but the laughter is wrong, rehearsed, hollow. Each year, Eliza said, they test the house. They circle it, they knock, they smile, they wait for someone to forget the ritual, and then they come closer. I could barely breathe. I forgot. I didn't perform it. No one has. Not for years. Her eyes turned to the window. Then you have 2 nights at most. She coughed again and reached for her nightstand. From beneath a folded quilt, she retrieved a small, rusted key. She pressed it into my hand. Box 211, Wellingham Savings. It's in the basement vault. You'll need to ask for George. He still remembers. I stared at the key, then at her. What's inside? Her lips trembled. The last arrangement, she said. Instructions, the salt pattern, the final candle. A vial of your blood would have been better, but we don't have time. She paused, and her gaze hardened. You've inherited the boundary now. I shook my head. I didn't agree to this. You bought the house. You crossed the crosses. You opened the vault. You read the names. It doesn't matter if you meant to. The land knows your name now. It knows your grief. That's all it needs. I stood, panic tightening my throat. What happens if I fail? She didn't blink. Then the arrangement ends, and the Hollow One remembers all at once. She gripped my wrist, her hand colder than the crypt. You'll either restore the boundary, she said, or be devoured by it. Then she turned her head to the wall, closed her eyes, and said no more. I left the room shaking. The key burned in my pocket. The snow began before sundown. Heavy, wet flakes that hissed against the windows like whispers. By the time I returned to the house, the driveway was gone. The trees were silhouettes, and the wind had taken on that strange, human quality, like breath in your ear. I stood at the front door, the rusted key from Eliza Langford pressed tight in my palm, and I understood. Tonight wasn't the ritual. It was the threshold, the last night before the winter solstice, the last night the arrangement might still be repaired. Tomorrow, the land would remember too much. Tonight, I had to prepare. The house felt alive when I stepped inside. Not in the warm, cozy way, in the lungs behind the walls kind of way. Like something that had been hibernating was now stretching its limbs beneath the floorboards. I could hear it. Soft, deliberate creaks. Not settling wood. Footsteps. Always 2 floors above. Always just out of reach. I didn't speak. Not even to myself. The Langford manual was specific. Silence during preparation. No names. No music. No memory spoken aloud. Any of those could invite attention. In the journal from the safe deposit box, Eliza had written, "The Hollow One cannot be seen at first. It listens. It mimics. It waits. Rituals that name it give it shape. Rituals that forget it give it power." On the kitchen table, I laid out the contents of the box. 7 silver crosses, each hand-etched with the Riley children's initials. A cloth bag of black salt. A small ceremonial knife. A parchment scroll with the Langford sigil and final invocation. And a tiny, sealed vial labeled in red ink, "Your blood." They had taken it from me, somehow, in my sleep. Maybe during one of the nights I woke with those child-sized handprints on my sheets. Or maybe I'd never woken up at all. I started with the door. Using the black salt, I traced the Langford circle on the inside of the frame, reciting the silent invocation in my head. The snow outside battered the glass like it wanted in. Not wind, not natural, testing. I moved through the house with quiet precision, placing each silver cross at key points: the attic ladder, the bedroom threshold, the center of the library floor, the basement stairs, the back door, the fireplace, and finally, the path leading to the mausoleum. Each cross was anchored with 3 drops of my blood. Eliza's instructions were painfully clear. These crosses do not protect you. They remind them. This house remembers the arrangement through symbols. Forget one, and it unravels. By the time I finished, it was after midnight. The wind had stopped, too suddenly. I lit the lantern from the vault, the one with the 7 half-melted candles. Each flame danced the wrong way, bending not from draft, but from presence. Like something was breathing near me that I couldn't see. I took the final step, the incantation. Standing in the center of the house, salt encircling me, I unrolled the parchment scroll and read the final Langford invocation. As witness to the hollow, I name the loss, but not the grief. I bind the silence with breath, the memory with shadow. I offer not death, but debt, paid in time, in blood, in silence. I return the names, but not the children. I remember, and that is enough. Then I unscrewed the vial and let the blood fall. 3 drops. 1 for memory, 1 for silence, 1 for the seal. The moment it touched the floor, the candles flickered, and then died. And from the woods outside, I heard them. Not just whispers now, screams. High-pitched, choked, layered with laughter that wasn't laughter, the sound of playtime gone wrong. I rushed to the front window, and I saw them. 7 small figures standing barefoot in the snow just beyond the first line of trees. No coats, no breath. Each holding hands, each smiling too widely. One stepped forward, a girl in a white dress with frozen curls clinging to her shoulders. She lifted her hand and waved. My phone rang. Not possible. No service, no calls in weeks. The screen showed unknown. I answered. A child's voice crackled on the line. "You didn't light our candles." Another voice whispered behind it. "You brought our names back, but not our toys." A third voice, deeper, older, angry. "You locked us out." I dropped the phone. They were at the door, not knocking, whispering through the keyhole. "We can help you finish the ritual. You don't need to be alone. You don't even have to bleed anymore." Their words came faster, stacking, overlapping, the pitch shifting like tape warping in heat. I didn't speak, I didn't move. The parchment had said no response, no acknowledgement, no grief allowed. That was the bait, that was the mirror. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to remember. Through me, one of them, I think the smallest boy, began to cry. It was soft, convincing, too convincing. "It hurts, mister. I don't want to be cold anymore." Then his voice dropped to something ancient and broken. "Let me in so I can wear your skin." I knelt in the center of the salt circle, took the knife, and reopened the cut on my palm. The fresh one, deeper now. Blood dripped onto the floor. One more time. For memory, for silence, for sealing. The house shuddered. Not metaphorically, the walls moved, groaned, split, and then held. Outside, the screams cut off like a rope pulled taut. The wind returned. Natural this time. Random. Indifferent. The figures were gone. The snow fell again. I stayed kneeling, heart pounding, breath fogging. It wasn't over, but I had done enough, for now.